Hi everybody, Russ from My Hammers 11. I hope everyone is safe and well. If you're new channel, please consider subscribing, hitting the bell icon so you may do every time we put new content on. And as always, like to thank our channel sponsors, Untitled. Check them out in the description below. We've got another edition of Russ's Rambles where we sort of don't talk totally about West Ham. Talk about there are other teams out there. There's another 91 out there, but we and plus the non-leagues as well. I forgot about that, and the Scottish leagues and MLS and everywhere else. But anyway, we're not just one. It's not just a one club channel. We like to get people from different aspects of the game in and have a little chat. Really. Now you would have remembered. I think it was last week sometime. We had Apu from BAME Hammers, and basically he continually plugged this book. So footballers. Black Pioneers book, Football's Black Pioneers book, and so we thought we'd get the two authors on because we thought, well, why not? Because it was a really interesting topic. There was lots of people were talking about it after Apu's video, retweeted by Mr. Sinclair as always. God bless Trevor Sinclair. So I thought let's get the two guys. How are we, David and Bill? How are we doing, guys?
I'm good, thanks.
Yeah, very well, thank you.
Thanks for coming on. I thought it was good. And also, we'll get this out before Christmas. So, it's probably a bit late for the Christmas rush now, to be honest. But with all the postage problems that everyone's having at the moment. So, but anyway, for the new year, everyone might want to talk about new stuff. Anyway, as you said, Apu was waxing lyrically about your book. And so what I thought would be good is to find out a bit more about why you started writing the book and stuff like that, and what was the thought processes, and it must have been a fascinating project to work on. It must have been absolutely brilliant. So I'll leave the floor over to you guys to talk about how it sort of came about, the idea and stuff.
Yeah, but you usually handle this one.
Okay, fair enough. That's probably because Bill's very modest and it was actually his idea. Bill and I were working. We've known each other through work for quite a few years, and we both retired in 2016. And around about that time, we were working on a project to do with black soldiers who served in the British Army during World War One. I think we've both got an interest in black history. And that project, though, I think 4 years ago, that project was beginning to wind down and come to an end. And Bill just sort of out of the blue contacted me and said, "I've had an idea for what we could do next. We could look at." The first black football at each of the 92 league clubs. And my immediate reaction was, that's a great idea, Bill. It also sounds like a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
And I think 4 years later, I can confirm, I do think it was a lot of hard work, but it was also a great idea. And I'm really glad that we did it. So
yeah. That's incredible. 4 years. That's incredible. It must be in terms of sort of, I mean, how would you go about, I don't know, we'll take West Ham. I mean, West Ham's probably maybe a slightly easier one, maybe, but what's the process to, how does it go back? Where, how does it define? Because obviously, it wouldn't necessarily. Did they have records of ethnicity of the players back then, or?
No, I wish they had, especially West Ham's case. I'm sure we'll talk about West Ham at length shortly.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, even things that were in the public domain, you had to test out. I mean, Leeds would have probably come back and said, "Our black player was Albert Johansson."
Yeah.
But actually, he wasn't. There was a player before Albert Johansson. And there's a whole range of, I mean, obviously the internet's useful, but it's got a lot of misinformation on there. Yeah. We've got newspaper archives, football clubs, club historians. So we really, birth certificates and marriage certificates and death certificates, we've got hundreds. So yeah, we did dig deep and long. We came up with some surprises. Some covers were surprised at what we found. But so far, we haven't been successfully challenged, which is reassuring for us, but welcome as well. I mean, if somebody comes along and says, actually, there was an earlier black player, then we'll hold our hands up and record it as such.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was hard work. It was fun.
I think that was the biggest fear, really, that somebody would say, no, you're wrong. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
No, I was about to say, no, I can imagine that. I mean, oh God, I know, I'm rubbish when it comes to any sort of West Ham history, and so even sort of the in the last 10 years, I slip up all the time, and I get sort of picked up on by some of my fact checkers who comment on my videos and say, no, it was Steve Lomas, not Michael Hughes. But that's what they do, and that's great. But it must be, I can imagine there'd be a lot of trepidation when you I mean, obviously, I'm not being, yeah, you wouldn't have just, yeah. I mean, there's 4 years of research has got into each of these, in terms of the 92. So there must still be, that little nagging thing in your mind, just in case, as you said something, there was another record or something like that which got destroyed, and it must have been absolutely fascinating. I mean, I did when I was in between jobs, not in between jobs. I was on my notice period for one of my previous jobs, and I started doing my ancestry thing because I was living in the office. It was a 3 month, and you'd go back, and it was just incredible the amount of information out there. But as you said, imagine with the internet, there's a lot of misinformation. As you said, people's might have assumed one player was, their first black player, but actually you've discovered it was someone else. What were the sort of the biggest surprises? Or some of them? I don't want to give too much away the books. I want people to buy the book, but in terms of some of the people you discovered.
Have you got any that spring to mind immediately? Or?
Well, I think in this context, I quite regularly talk about Rochdale's first black player. I mean, there's a couple of interesting things to say about Rochdale. You don't hear that sentence very often, do you?
No, you don't.
I mean, I was following the career of Tony Collins, and I'd started with Tony Collins because we established he was Crystal Palace's first black player. So it was fairly natural for me to kind of then follow him around the country as he moved. Sure. After Crystal Palace, he went to Rochdale, and that was the last team he played for. And I was pretty sure that Rochdale, he would have been the first black player at Rochdale. I mean, he'd been the first black player at York, Watford, Crystal Palace. Wow. Pretty sure he was also the first black player at Torquay, although because they're not in the league, we didn't sort of really delve into that, but he probably was. So when he went to Rochdale, I thought, well, bound to be the first black player at Rochdale. And I'm really glad that, I don't know, on a hunch, I kind of contacted the Rochdale Fans Forum. And for a while they said, yeah, Tony Collins. But then a couple of really old heads came on and said, no, there was a guy before him, and it was called Calvin Simons. And we checked the records, and a guy called Calvin Simons did indeed play one game for Rochdale away at Barrow. So possibly the least romantic debut anybody could make. And so I started looking into Calvin Simons, and he'd written his autobiography, which he called My Way. But I got hold of a second-hand copy of that, and it was an interesting read. He had some interesting stuff to say about his time in Rochdale. Sure. And the nice thing about Calvin is he's still alive, and I've spoken to him over the phone in Bermuda, where he was born and where he currently lives. Wow. And he's a lovely, lovely guy. He really is. But to say, he was absolutely chuffed when he was told he was the first black player at Rochdale and that his name was appearing in our book.
I think the reason he wrote his autobiography is that he's a very famous cricketer.
Yeah,
much better cricketer than he was a footballer.
Yeah.
Just thinking back to the old records that we were looking at, sometimes we were lucky that racism was alive and well then, because invariably a black player would be referred to as darky or coloured, whereas we'll have lost that source now, thank goodness.
Yes.
But going back to the 1900s, the 1890s, if anyone was non-white, the press would comment on it quite often in quite disparaging terms. So that did help, because otherwise we wouldn't have known. Ethnicity wasn't recorded anywhere.
No, of course. Yeah, of course. And I can imagine, there was, as I said, 4 years of going through newspaper clippings and talking to, because obviously, tapping into, I imagine every club has their own bunch of fans forums and statos who would help you on your journey. So I imagine you became quite friendly with a lot of fans forums across the country over the last 4 years, to be honest.
From my point of view, very much. I mean, Accrington have become my second club. they were so helpful, and I know David had a lot of very, very helpful fans forums and so on. Wickham were really helpful as well, but sure.
I mean, fans forums can certainly the Palace forum. I don't know what the West Ham forum's like, but Palace forum can get really quite. People. It only takes about 3 comments and somebody's sort of starting calling each other names. It doesn't take long for a thread to degenerate in that way. The Rochdale form, I have to say, they were a lovely bunch. And I looked through a whole load of threads, not necessarily just to do with black players, and they were having a lovely amicable little chats amongst themselves. It was a very nice group at Rochdale. And so you do come across groups like that, and I actually found it quite refreshing compared to the Palace forum, frankly. So
yes, no, yeah, that's true. It seems, but also, I mean, it's yes, some forums a bit like that, yes, and some obviously you have different forums within fan bases, isn't it? You probably have there's one which is probably really pro and one which is pretty against, and yeah, it's and you have to sort of imagine when you're going into a new club, evaluate sort of if this is going to be a good source or if it's loads of people who think they know what they're talking about, but they don't know what they're talking about. It must be fascinating because you're getting a glimpse of, in essence, the fan base across those 92 clubs in some guise, in some description. And it must have been, as I said, 4 years. That's a hell of a journey. And I can imagine. I remember you saying before, Bill, that you went on a West Brom podcast, and the guy was waxing lyrically about the Baggies being the first team to play 3 back players, and to inform that West Ham had been about 7 years. So,
yeah. West Ham have a good track record. They really do.
Yeah.
First England's first black player.
Yes.
First black player to win a trophy. The FA Youth Cup. John Charles.
And captain the team.
Yeah.
He captained.
Very unusual.
Yeah.
He did, yeah, and I mean that's the thing. I think there's always been, with the old West Ham hat on, as you said, it's always it's although there was always a reputation of West Ham fans of who they were. There was always black players in the team. It seemed from a relatively early time. And I mean, we had Apu doing his Black 11 from the play. Obviously, nowadays it's a lot easier than it was many years ago. And obviously you have guys like the BAME Hammers and there's BAME organisations all over the country as well. So I imagine they would have been really on board with what you guys were doing as well, which again would have given you, it must be nice when you have like people like Apu, for example, loving your book and being from the BAME community as well. It must have been sort of a seal of approval, so to speak, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very much. And I mean, Asian heritage players were very much in short supply.
Yeah.
But it was lovely to be able to find two that played for Watford at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. They were almost certainly the first Indian heritage players to have played professional football. And it's nice to be able to find a role model for the Asian kids who might be playing football. So it was nice to find the Cother brothers. They were, and I know Abu was quite excited by it.
He was.
So it's good.
He really was. Then,
but I mean, there's another West Ham connection, in fact, with Jack Leslie. The player who got picked for England. I mean, not only was he born there, but he worked in the boot room at West Ham. Yeah. So a lot of history at West Ham in terms of black football.
Yeah. Yeah, there has been, and even Asian football. I mean, we had Anwar Udin, who's his assistant manager at Aldershot with Danny Searle, and he was the first. I'm going to get it wrong, but I apologise. I think it's the first Bangladeshian professional player in the game, or captain. Again, I'm probably getting completely wrong. I do apologise to Anwar. We've had him on the show. He's a lovely bloke, and maybe I should have done my research beforehand. But it's great for someone like Apu, because we were talking about that exact thing, the fact that he could do his Black 11, but he couldn't necessarily do his Asian 11 because it's an area which obviously there's not many Asian players professional players in the game, let alone at West Ham. So it is what it is. But it must have been. I mean, how's the book sales going at the moment? Is it selling well? You happy with how it's going so far?
I think it's selling too well, isn't it? Amazon get a batch, and then next thing it's disappeared. So they say not available or no longer available, and you think. Yeah. So, but yeah, it's been very well received in terms of reviews. Everybody that reads it writes fantastic reviews. It's no bestseller. It's not going to challenge J.K. Rowling or anything like that. But nor did we expect it to. It was a labour of love.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with everything that's going on in the world, and obviously Black Lives Matter and things like that, it sort of it puts in, and obviously all the stuff with Jack Leslie and stuff, it sort of it put it into perspective really. And I think when the Jack Leslie stuff came out, I think everyone did start going back and thinking, oh, actually, what would our first player be, or as a club? And obviously, you go through each of the clubs and into that particular player. And I think it's definitely, I think since lockdown there's a thirst of for knowledge about your own club, sort of historically, because particularly with the first lockdown there was no football for 100 days. I mean, I started this channel and people really loved it because it was nostalgic and it's going back. And I think now there's a thirst, and particularly with things like Black Lives Matters and stuff, you've got this need to know your heritage, so to speak, and your heritage of your club. And same with Rainbow Laces and all the other fantastic stuff that they do to promote other groups. But Black Lives Matter and this book as well, particularly, it came along at the right time, it seemed.
Yeah, I mean, I think 4 years ago when we started out on this project, it was kind of just something we were doing to almost entertain ourselves. And I don't think we dreamt then just how relevant it would be. And actually, it's very sad how relevant it is. I mean, 4 years ago, I don't think there would have been that much interest. There wouldn't have been as much interest in this book. And there is interest now. Really, I think in many ways for the wrong reasons, because we shouldn't really be talking about some of the things we are talking about in 2020. Nevertheless, I mean, I do think the book, it's almost by accident, it's turned into a sort of social history book in many ways. I mean, you've got 130 years of black British footballers. I mean, the first one was in the 1880s, Arthur Wharton, and there's been a black player playing in the English Football League every decade since then. So I mean, through that period, the experiences of the black players reflect in many ways the experiences of the larger black community, and the stories we've uncovered reflect those experiences as well. So I think it's actually been really interesting from that point of view.
Yeah, it's almost like a sociological sort of book as well. I know it's about football, but as you said, it's how societies change, and we're getting very deep, aren't we? God, for West Ham, but it's how societal changes throughout the decades, as you said, with more and more black players come in because of more acceptance of different ethnicities in terms of the game, but in terms of society in general. And like, as you said, nowadays, and it's obviously the big push now is to get more, as we said before, more Asian based kids playing football and stuff, and get them into the Premier Leagues and getting them into, because to have a similar standpoint, because why shouldn't they? It doesn't matter what color your skin is. If you're good enough to play football, you're good enough to play football. And I know that West Ham are doing quite a lot of that at the moment through their community stuff, and the West Ham community and all the stuff that Kevin does and things like that. So I can definitely see that. And I think, as you said, this is going to be, this type of book is going to be something which, it's going to be a great quiz question book as well, because it's a great quiz night question, isn't it? Because you've got the actual you've got the researched answer by you guys as well. Which club was the toughest one to find out, to discover? So imagine some might be relatively easy, but some you might have, obviously 4 years, 92 clubs, 4 years. There must be some which maybe have taken a lot longer than others to get to the final, get to the bottom of, so to speak.
Do you want to
Well,
answer that?
I would probably say for me it was probably Crewe Alexandra, because we got no help from the club whatsoever, which wasn't unusual. Yeah, because it's no real interest to the clubs who their first black player was, really. So we struggled to get any information on that. But when we did find the alleged first black player, we were introduced to him as the first black Australian to have played in the Football League back in 1946. And the deeper we dug, the more it became obvious he'd never been in Australia in his life. So Wikipedia's got him down as Australian. Press reports do as well, because they were only reporting either what he'd told them or what had been written elsewhere. So we eventually found he was born in Manchester. He was his father was an habitual criminal. In fact, I found him in something called the Habitual Criminals Register, which I had no idea existed.
Brilliant.
So yeah, he I think his first offence was stealing 2 brushes, and he got 6 strokes of the birch for that. And anybody who says the birch is a deterrent is wrong, because 6 months later he was in court. I think he'd stolen 2 dolly tubs, 8 pegs, a bar of soap, and a hen. And he spent.
It sounds like one of those fast show sketches. Do you know when the guys, did you go and get all the shopping? Yeah, even better than that. I got a bar of soap, 8 pegs, and so carry on, Bill. Sorry.
So he spent a lot of his life in and out of prison, and his son did likewise. I mean, he was obviously a good footballer because he was good enough to play for a few professional teams, but he preferred the life of crime and gambling and so on. So his story was pretty fascinating, and obviously a difficult one to research, and one we needed to make absolutely certain we got our facts right. I mean, he did die a long time ago, but who knows? Who might sort of look at it and
might
say,
sue us.
hang on a minute, he was Australian.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, another interesting story, which is also Bill, so I'm going to prompt Bill. Steve Mcconey was a fascinating story as well, because I mean, I think you described him as a Walter Mitty character, so I think it's worth saying a bit about Steve Mcconey.
Oh, Steve Mcconey is, again, if you go to the internet, you'll find him described as on a par with Pelé, the greatest footballer Africa has ever produced. His first club in England was Coventry in the 3rd Division South, and he played a handful of games and they got rid of him. He then joined Barnsley. He played 1 game, a League Cup game against Southport, and the director's minutes from 5 days later are, how can we get rid of this bloke? And the manager was given the task of basically getting rid of Mcconey, and he came back and said, well, Mcconey will go if we'll pay his airfare to Lisbon. So they got rid of him. He then joined Cardiff, I think, and played about 5 games for Cardiff. So a totally dismal failure in England, even though he's as good as Pelé.
Yeah.
And then when we looked at the other things he claimed, they were outrageous. He claimed he was sold for £90,000 when the world record transfer fee was £93,000, and Barnsley had just actually given him. In fact, Barnsley had paid to get rid of him. So he a real Walter Mitty character, and he ended up in jail in a US jail for 12 years. For his involvement in an acid attack on his wife and her attorney. So but even now, there is a Dutch reporter produced a book claiming that Mcconey was innocent, and I've read the court papers, and I've not really seen anybody more guilty in my life.
Yeah.
But the theory, to be fair to Mcconey, the theory is that he was a member of the African National Council, Congress rather. Nelson Mandela's group. Yeah. And therefore he was set up. So he hadn't really done all these things, but I'm not convinced. But yeah, what a character!
I think
he's dead now as well.
If we had an award for the least pleasant character in the book, I think Steve Mcconey would be right up there as a contender.
Yeah, sounds like it. And I can imagine, as you said, uncovering all these different stories. It's as you said with him and the previous ones. There's some nasty stories you've fallen apart. You've fallen into just by uncovering people's history and stuff. So it must be. I mean, obviously, you mentioned how you spoke to I forgot the guy's name in Bermuda. Are there any others you managed to chat to as the response of finding them out in the book?
Well, Bill's spoken to quite a few footballers, but just before we move on to that, I just wanted to say about Asian footballers and this debate about why is it that Asian footballers don't play as much as you might expect them to, and there's the kind of football's not part of the Asian culture. I just wanted to say that Bill has spoken to a couple of players from the Caribbean.
Yep.
Who became one of whom became a very successful footballer and came over here as a child, never having played football in his life, sort of very keen on cricket. And that was Brendan Batson, who went on obviously to play for Arsenal and West Bromwich Albion. Yeah. So I don't know that football necessarily is embedded into the Caribbean culture in the same way that cricket is. And yet that hasn't stopped players from the Caribbean coming over here and performing very, very successfully. So I think, I've heard, I'm not sure if it was Apu himself, but saying that we could use the Caribbean players as a kind of a role model. Say, look, if they can do it, so can we. So anyway, that was a point I wanted to make. I think it's not necessarily all to do with culture, or if it is, then you can change sort of people's culture.
Sure. Yeah, no, it is. You're totally right. I think you're totally right, and I think Happy said exactly the same thing. Yeah, the fact there's, you know, and I imagine for a lot of Asian players as well, or Asian kids growing up, there's other sports that take and activities and stuff like that, which maybe take precedence. And as you said, with the Caribbean players and cricket particularly, we've had lots of successful, you know, Caribbean players. Even Clive Best.
Exactly. Yeah,
God
exactly.
bless best, you know, and you know, and he's still flying the flag for us over there as well. So, but I mean, it must have been fascinating finding, like, speaking to players. You know, once you've discovered they are the first, if they, you know, and if they're still alive and they're the first black player of their club, were some of them aware of that? You know, when you told them that, or was it sort of they knew it but they didn't talk about it?
Bill, I think that's your Chris Camara story.
Yeah, I mean,
Chris Camara story coming up.
Yeah,
brilliant. Strap yourself in.
Having slagged Mcconey off, I really need to say that everybody I interviewed was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris Camara was the first black player at Swindon, and he didn't have a clue until I told him.
Brilliant.
And he came along to the interview, and he brought this scrapbook. It was a Mr. Men's scrapbook. And he claimed that his wife kept it. I don't know. I wasn't going to argue with him, but anyway, he opened the scrapbook. He said, "I had no idea till you told me." And yet the press cuttings were very much Swindon signed coloured boy. You know, Swindon get their first coloured player. That's the language of the day, obviously.
Yeah.
So yeah, Chris didn't know he was the first black player at Swindon. Viv Anderson didn't even remember his debut. I mean, can you imagine us three as football fanatics? If we played one game, we would never forget a minute of it.
Yeah, exactly.
He had no idea it was away at Sheffield Wednesday. It was a 3-2. It was crowd trouble. And he'd completely forgotten. I mean, I know he played 700 games, to be fair.
Yeah.
But wow, you know. So, you know, not all of them were aware of any significance. And certainly I've been at matches where a black player's been making their debut, and it meant nothing to me at the time.
Yeah.
I saw Bobby Fischer make his debut for Orient at Sunderland. David saw a much more famous debut, Paul Canaville. David, I don't know if you want to...
Yeah, I mean, I can do. I mean, this was... I haven't got the date to hand, but Paul, perhaps Bill can look at that while I speak, maybe.
1982, wasn't it, I think?
Thank you very much, Bill. This was at Selhurst Park. Palace were playing Chelsea. We were 1-0 down, a few minutes to go. So obviously I was concentrating on the game, hoping Palace would score a goal that never did come that night. But if you read Paul Canaville's autobiography, he came out to warm up to be sent on as a sub, you know, late in the second half, and he was warming up, and he was booed by his own fans while he was warming up to come on. And I was there, I was in the crowd. I don't remember that at all. I mean, if I heard the boos, I don't suppose I would have known what was going on. So this was a huge moment in Paul Canaville's life. I mean, he was really, really upset by it, understandably so. And it just passed me by. I was completely oblivious to it. So there's a piece of history being made there. Paul Canaville making his Chelsea debut, and I'm just oblivious. So I often am.
Of course, the one that couldn't be forgotten was Viv Anderson's first game for England.
Sure.
And he was well aware of that. The press were well aware of it. He tells me the dressing room was full of people. He got a telegram from the Queen. He got a telegram from Elton John. So that clearly was a notable event. But the press leading up to that first cap for a black player had been full of it. You know, will it be Laurie Cunningham? Will it be Viv Anderson? And obviously Viv got the nod. But yeah, he was well aware of that one.
Well, of course, yeah. I suppose when you go to England, it's another level, really, isn't it? So you've got that sort of it's not just his local areas news and press and maybe a little clipping in the nationals, but it's a national thing. And that would have been a huge. And I can imagine, obviously we would have forget that. Maybe not his league debut, but that's brilliant.
Well, I'll tell you one funny story. He when I interviewed him, he said he thought he'd scored the first goal by a black player for England, and I kind of knew he hadn't, but I didn't want to be rude.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I think it was Luther Blissett. He says, no, I think it might have been me. It was against Yugoslavia, and they were still called Yugoslavia in those days. So I said, well, I'll check it out. So I went back and I checked.
Yeah.
And I came back and I said, Viv, you thought it might have been the first goal scored by a black player for England? Yeah. I says, wasn't even the first goal scored by Viv Anderson for England. You'd scored an earlier one against Turkey. So what a memory.
Brilliant. And like we've had, one of my friends had Cammy on his podcast the other day, and I mean, they're all lovely, aren't they? I mean, you've spoken to loads of players, Bill. Obviously, I've spoken to quite a few on the channel. Obviously, all of mine are West Ham, but they're all just so. It's maybe that generation. Everyone's so like happy, so free to give their time away and talk about things and talk about memories, even if they don't necessarily remember the memories, but you remember them for them. And that must be a real sort of, obviously, the whole book, the whole project's a labour of love for both of you. I know you're big football fans, but talking to ex-players, and that must have been sort of the ideal hobby to start with, and then obviously it grew to this fantastic book. But it must have been such an enjoyable ride for those sort of 4 years. Frustrating, I appreciate, but at times must have been so sort of so what's the word, fulfilling when the book the final draft had gone to the publishers.
Yeah, I mean that was an interesting one in itself, because we needed to know who the 92 clubs were going to be. Yeah. And of course, with the season extending. So I remember standing over the television when Harrogate were playing Notts County in the playoff final. And the minute the final whistle went, we knew it was going to be Harrogate in the 92nd chapter. So it's not quite literally two, but you almost press one button as opposed to the Notts County button.
Two edits, yeah.
Yeah. But we got a nice Notts County chapter as well. We're waiting for them to get promoted.
They're back in for a reprint next time they get promoted. And since the book's been published, have any clubs come to you and spoken more about it? Because to put together, I know, videos for their club sites or anything like that yet, or is it just or is it mainly sort of from the fans that sort of you're getting the feedback from?
Well, I think Bill will agree with me. I think generally the clubs themselves have been pretty useless throughout this whole process, to be honest. Sure. I mean, they weren't very helpful at all with the research. I mean, most of them didn't answer inquiries at all. And it is a bit, I think a few people have said how surprised they are that the clubs haven't kind of pounced on this, particularly during Black History Month. Yeah. Which was, you would have thought they would have been interested in the stories, but I think we aren't alone in finding out that actually they really tend not to be. I think Bill was on a podcast with somebody else, which he can talk about, where that guy had been desperately trying to get the clubs interested in stories, and they just weren't interested. It's very odd.
Yeah, because it's a free gift to them, really. I mean, we're not, as you can see, we're not hardened businessmen or anything. We're just two guys with a hobby, produced the book, got loads of information we want to share with people. But here-ho.
You think it's a bizarre. I mean, as you said, it's a gimme. It's an own goal, really. It's the simplest bit of content that clubs can make. Really, you've done all the research for them. They need to go and find someone to voice it over and talk to you about it, and that's it. It's not like you think they'd all want to do it. As you said, particularly with Black Lives Matter and Black History Month and stuff like that. It's very bizarre, very strange. I don't know, but then again, I not from my own personal experience, but a lot of clubs have, the people in the teams aren't necessarily, from having affiliation with that club. They're marketing people or commercial people who don't necessarily have that sort of what's the word? That sort of natural. They don't support the clubs or things like that. So naturally there will be, it's interesting, but we're pushing out some new content about something else, and that's going to get more clicks and stuff. But I think it's really surprised me. I mean, as I said, I think, I know, especially if it's so many sort of bodies, like as I said, like the Bayham Hammers and stuff, that it's just so important it's part of the club's fabric. Each club you've done all that 92, it's an important milestone for everyone, really, when who their first black player was, when it was, how that sort of compared to other clubs. And particularly, as you said, for West Ham, we've got a few little firsts, which is great for us. I don't like talking too much about West Ham in these ones, but it's something which I think that people need to revere more as well, definitely, because it's part of their history. Who knows? Maybe I don't know. I don't know, but I think it has really surprised me. Really surprised me. I thought you'd have said, yeah, they've all wanted to get on board.
Well,
yes,
to be fair, the fans have the podcast and the fans. They're really interested, and as you say, perhaps it's because the clubs are not really that committed to the sort of passionate side of football.
Makes sense.
I think it's worth mentioning there are actually 93 chapters because we didn't have the heart to drop out Macclesfield, and I think Bill's got a nice story about Macclesfield as well. I believe I'm right in saying that this is the player you went to interview where you thought you probably ought to wear shin pads because he'd been sent off so many times. Is that am I right?
Yeah, Effie Sodja, you'll remember him, that the Nigerian who used to wear the bandana, perhaps.
Yes.
He's a very good player. He played against England in the World Cup for Nigeria. Big guy, but unfortunately a gentle giant because I think he'd been sent off 19 times, and he thought that was fairly normal. Well, I was just a committed player. But yeah, he was a nice man.
And I can imagine, I mean, that's the thing, everyone you've spoken to, I can imagine is just. I mean, it's particularly for the players themselves. It must have been nice when you're talking to them that they've got that there's this book, there's some recognition for something, even if they didn't necessarily know it's like Cammy did. But they must have been really on board with the whole thing.
I think a lovely one was Neville Chamberlain.
Yeah.
Now, most people haven't heard of Neville Chamberlain, but he's Mark Chamberlain's older brother. Mark was the second black player to play for England, and he's the father of Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain. And of course, I mean, Neville probably has lived in the shadows of Mark to some extent all of his life. Yeah. So he was thrilled a bit to know that he wasn't just the first black player at Port Vale, he was at Newport as well. So Neville got two chapters to himself, and Mark and obviously Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain didn't get any at all.
Yeah.
And there's a guy called Dave Busby who, I mean, I had a lovely night out with Dave when I was interviewing him. Great character. And he was the first black player at Brighton. And as it turned out, it was the first black player at Barrow, although they weren't in the league at the time that I interviewed him. But, Dave only played, I think he played 3 games for Brighton. But he's in the book. He's got 2 chapters to himself, and he's got a place in history. A bit like Calvin Simons with his 1 game for Rochdale.
Yeah. And that's what I mean. It's part of history. As you said, he's only played 3 games at Brighton, but he's their first ever black player. And I'm the same when I interview so I don't necessarily, obviously, you could go and interview, Julian Dix or people like that. But I like interviewing the guys who've only played like 10 games for the club, because as we were saying, as fans, if we only played 1 game, that's enough. We could go to our grave as for our club, we've played a game, and just to the same process, because they deserve to be. They've all worn the claret and blue. Same with as you said. Chamberlain, he wore that Brighton shirt. He's just as much as today. Glenn Murray's on loan, but I'm not very good with Brighton players, but they always beat us anyway, so I'm not bothered about them. They'll beat us not Boxing Day 27th, so I'm not bothered about them. But yeah, it's really important to give these guys their time to shine. And as you said, with Chamberlain, as you said, he's lived in the shadows of his brother and his nephew. So give him a couple of chapters and that's it. He'll probably buy loads of books and send them around anyone anyway. So if anything.
To be fair to Neville, he was a decent player as well, and he played several hundred games.
Yes.
I think when we started out, when we were first chatting about this idea, I'm deciding, well, why should we do it? What's important about it? I think one of the things we said was, there are going to be these players who are simply going to be forgotten. I mean, if nobody writes this down now, in a few years' time, they will have gone and they'll have faded from people's memories altogether. I'm quite sure that if we'd waited, a few more years and I'd gone to the Rochdale Fans Forum, I suspect Calvin Simon's name would have just disappeared,
I totally agree.
Forever. And, people like Dave Busby as well. They had a brief, fleeting career, and it deserves to be remembered. It may not have been big, and it may not have been long, and it may not have been very lucrative in those days. But nonetheless, they were breaking new ground. They were blazing trails.
Totally.
Remember them.
Well, especially unfortunately, as generations die, I don't be nasty, but as generations, fall off the cliff, so to speak, it's the same with me. And there's in terms of the people I interview, obviously we interview fans and players, but from the fans' perspective, less and less people saw Bobby Moore play.
Yeah.
interview, and that will happen all the time. So, as you said, you've categorized these people, so they'll always be in print, and there'll always be some sort of documentation of the as you said, sort of the groundbreaking nature of their appearance. You said it might have been fleeting, and for that particular club, but in terms of what it meant in the structure of that club itself, is it can't be. It can't be sort of downplayed at all, because it's a phenomenal achievement to be the first black player of that particular club, and no, it's brilliant. I love it. I think it's such a fantastic idea. What's next?
It's a hard one to follow, isn't it?
Somebody suggested black managers, but that would be a pretty slim book.
Yeah.
And I think a number of people that Bill interviewed, the players, they said, that's really the next big barrier to overcome. Why there's so few black managers in the game? Because I think we were sort of on an event last night that talked a lot about Viv Anderson. Of course, he was one of the very few who actually made it into management. He was manager at Barnsley for a year, and then he and Brian Robson at Middlesbrough for 7 years, I think.
Yeah.
But there weren't many who made that transition from player to manager, and some white players seem to do it really easily, and if they fail once, they get another job, and if they fail again, they get another job. And I think we could all name the managers who just go from club to club after failure. Yeah. But the black managers seem to get one chance, and if they don't make a sort of stunning success of it, that's it really. No second chances.
Yeah, it's very true. Very, very true. And yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. It's the next barrier for black players now. Is black ex players is moving into management and coaching, and it's as you said, it's a strange thing as well, isn't it? It's like when someone like Sol Campbell broke into sort of league management. It was like the media hoo-ha about it, and it's like, well, Scott Parker was a man, it's just the fact that he's black means that he has to have these extra pressure on him, and no, he's just an ex-player. He was bloody good defender for England and them down 3-point lane and Arsenal and stuff, but so what, and it's and you're right, when there's managers who will come in, maybe not naming names, but managers who've come in maybe who haven't managed for about 2 or 3 years and take over West Brom, for example.
Can't imagine who you're talking about.
No names at all. No, I haven't checked the news recently. Hope Slav and Julian are doing well. But yeah, no, it's surprising, isn't it? It does, and I think with obviously the States, you've got Rooney's Law in there. Rooney's Rule or Rooney's Law? It's one of the where sort of at least they have to have some black representation on the recruitment in terms of who they interview. Obviously, it's the next step, isn't it? It's the next step for us in terms of the English game to have these guys. To have more and more black players, more black managers in the top flights, definitely. And
but that's what Viv says. He wrote the foreword to the book, Viv Anderson, and he said in 1994 he became manager of Barnsley, and he was one of two managers then, two black managers, and he said we thought that was the beginning of the the turnaround, and here we are, sort of 26 years later, and it just hasn't happened.
Yeah. Well, I think stuff like this book as well as things like Black Lives Matters and Black History Month and stuff like that, it only does the best. It only does, does the right stuff to get this put onto the agenda a bit more. Do you know what I mean? And as I said, it's a natural progression, isn't it? The first black player. Well, what's the next thing? Next thing is the first black manager of the club and stuff. And so it's and as I said, from a fan's perspective, it's as long as they win, they don't care who it is really at all, isn't it? As long as they're playing well or the team are playing well, it could be it could be a Chilean manager, it could be a Scottish manager, it could be it doesn't matter what colour skin they are, as long as they do the job and pick up the points, then that's all that matters. But no, it's a fascinating subject.
I think I said at the beginning that there were a couple of interesting things to say about Rochdale, which is quite an unusual sentence. Calvin Simons as the first black player was one of those things. But I think the other thing is to remember is that they also had the first black manager in the Football League at all. And that was a guy called Tony Collins. Tony Collins was the player I thought was going to be their first black player when I sort of got in touch with the Rochdale Fans Forum. Sure. But he wasn't. He was their second. But he went there after he left Crystal Palace, and Rochdale was his last club. He played for one season. And at the end of that season, the manager at the time, Jack Marshall, got a move to Blackburn Rovers, which was a big step up for Jack Marshall. And so there was a vacancy, and Jack Marshall said to Tony Collins, "You should apply." And apparently the players are all behind him as well. "You should definitely get the job, Tony." And there's quotes in Tony's book about, from the chairman of the club. And he clearly realised that this could be quite a controversial decision, because he's saying, I know it might not go down well with everybody, but I think he's the best man for the job, and I don't really care about the colour of his skin. That sort of comment. So he obviously was aware that he was sort of breaking new ground by appointing a black manager. And I say, Tony Collins goes down in history as being the first black manager in the Football League, and there haven't been as many as there should have been since him.
Definitely not. As you said, as with Alison said, he thought he was breaking ground really when he took over Barnsley, and unfortunately here we are 25 years later, and we're still talking about the same things, isn't we? So but it's been great, and obviously, guys, it's a fascinating book, and 4 years is a real labour of love. So it's as we said, we've had lots of people who commented when Appy was talking about his video and started talking about the book, and he's done your plug for you, to be honest.
Oh, he's been brilliant.
We'll have the description of it in the Amazon link in the description below. And as I said, if if Amazon have got some copies off, get it in. If not, just wait until they get some new batch.
I mean, you can get it from our publisher, Conquer Editions. You can get it from Waterstones, any good bookseller. Yeah. But it's and if people do buy it, I hope they really enjoy it.
I'm sure they will. And thank you, gentlemen, for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Something a bit different to talk about, and hopefully people will enjoy it, because it's not all about West. Although we do talk quite a bit about West Ham in this little episode. It's not we try and sort of even it out with all the other clubs, all the 92 clubs. But thank you so much for your time, David. Thank you, Bill, as well.
Thanks, Russ.
And hope you have a lovely Christmas, you two, as well, and a happy New Year. And so obviously, and thank you to everyone else for watching, and from myself and from Bill, and from the Bill's down there. So Bill and David. No, wrong way, David. There we go. I still haven't figured it out. This thing, how the camera works. But take care, everyone. Stay safe. Wash those hands, and speak to you guys very, very soon. Take care, everyone. Much love. Bye bye.